With a little over a month to go till the start of the NHL season, it is time to start power ranking division by division. Today, the Pacific.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Locked On NHL. I am Nick Zararis, the host of Locked On Oilers. That is Hunter Hodies, one of the hosts of Locked On Penguins. We want to thank everybody who's making Locked On NHL their first listen of the day. Locked On NHL, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. And today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code Locked On NHL for $20 off your first purchase. So, Hunter, today we take a stab at the Pacific Division. The defending Western Conference champions hail from this division, sent 4 teams to the playoffs last year, produced one of the better wildcard teams of recent memory in Vegas, who took Dallas to the brink in that first round series as well. A whole lot to tackle. So let's start at the outset. When you were putting together your rankings, were you looking at this in terms of who's the best, most likely to win the Stanley Cup? Were you looking at this in terms of who's going to be the best team going into the regular season? How'd you put your list together before we get into it?
So I do look at the regular season, but I also mainly just look at who is most likely to make the Stanley Cup playoffs. That's how I always have done my division predictions. You know, I usually look at, the top 4 teams in each division, I usually feel like have the best shot, obviously, at making the playoffs. So I usually go based off that formula. I look at some of the moves that the teams made over the offseason to help me with those projections for this season. But I mainly, when I sit down and make my division predictions, I just go off, okay, who is most likely to make the playoffs compared to who is just, kind of rebuilding, kind of stuck in the middle, stuff like that.
All right, fair enough, brother. Let's get to number 8. I cede the floor to you. I assume I know who your answer is, but who do you have last and why?
So I have the San Jose Sharks at last in this division, and that's no disrespect to the Sharks. They got better this offseason. They obviously have Macklin Celebrini making his NHL debut this year. He's going to be awesome. I really like William Eklund as well. I think he has the potential to be one of the more underrated players in the league this year. Tyler Toffoli, really strong top 6 winger. He's usually good for, 20 goals, 40, 45 points at least during the season. I like Zetterlund as well in the top 6. Will Smith is a very good player. Even Mikhail Granlund last year put up some decent numbers for the Sharks. Defensively, it's not the greatest, but it's still, I think, a little bit better than last year. And then in goal, Nick, they do have Askarov, Mackenzie Blackwood. I do think Askarov is going to be the starter at some point for the Sharks this year. I'm decently high on his ceiling for the NHL, but I still look at the other teams in the division, and I think the Sharks are still the worst right now. That's going to change, obviously, in the next year, 2 and 3, as, Celebrini, gets acquainted in the NHL. Will Smith continues his development. The Sharks go out into free agency and maybe make some more trades to help the roster. But right now, I still feel like the Sharks are the worst team in this division, but it's not going to be that way for long.
You might be surprised to hear me say I have the Flames last. I think that goalie situation is extremely volatile. Seems like underselling it, because we're talking about Dustin Wolf, who has all of 20 NHL starts, and Daniel Vladar, who has less than 100 career NHL starts, and you're going into a season with those two guys as your presumptive tandem. You're another year older on Kadri, on Huberdeau, on Blake Coleman. I don't want to say their season is going to be defined by who they decide to trade again, but it really does seem like that's going to be the case this year for the Flames, that if they want to start unloading their position even further, whether it's Rasmus Anderson, whether you could find someone to take that Kadri contract, I don't see the Flames scoring a lot of goals, and they're not going to be very good defensively, and their goaltending is a massive question mark. I think the reason I have them lower than San Jose is, frankly, they just have so much more unknown. Like San Jose, they didn't do anything splashy, but you add Toffoli, you add Celebrini, like you said, you add Alex Wenberg, you add Cody Ceci, and yes, Cody Ceci from what they had is an improvement. So you just get a higher floor. You know what you're getting in those guys. You think you're going to get a nice little bump from Eklund, from Will Smith. They have enough guys on that team where I can talk myself into them being better than the Flames. Number 7, sir.
I can see that. I do have the Flames at number 7 on my list. I don't think the Flames are going to be any good this year. It feels like Craig Conroy this is the start of him really tearing this thing down in Calgary and kind of going from the ground up again. I understood they did what they could, trying to replace, Matthew Tkachuk in that trade as well. And overall, it hasn't worked out the way they thought it was going to. Kadri, he was good for a little bit. It just hasn't worked out the way they thought it was going to. They did sign Anthony Mantha, which I do think was fine. But when you have Michael Backlund as your top center, you're just really not going anywhere, I feel like, at least for this season as a team. It feels like Jonathan Huberdeau has not played that well since going to Calgary. I mean, he's had really good seasons in the league before, but it feels like it just hasn't worked out the way Flames fans thought it was going to. I obviously still like Blake Coleman as a player as well. Mackenzie Weegar, one of the most underrated defensemen in the NHL, but you hit the nail on the head in terms of the goaltending situation. Like, Dustin Wolf and Dan Vladar just doesn't inspire a lot of confidence in terms of a tandem. And I do think this is going to be another year where Craig Conroy tries to sell off some of his players at the deadline to try and continue this, rebuild on the fly, if you want to call it that as well. So I think things for the Flames this year are going to get worse before they get better.
Agreed with you in that respect. Kadri's fine, but if he's the best player on your team, you're not a very good team. Like, he's a good player. He's a talented player. He can flirt with 70, 80 points. But if he's your best player, you're not a very good hockey team. Kadri's a great 2. You saw it in Colorado. You can win a cup with Kadri as your 2 seed. Number 7 for me, I have the Sharks, as you had previously mentioned. They spent a bit in free agency. They get the first overall pick. I'm very curious to see what their actual plan is as they continue to build this out and try and surround Celebrini, Will Smith, Eklund and Shakir Makmadulin, surround those guys with veteran talent. If they're going to continue to spend, if they're going to try and take some flyers on some younger guys, try and do some RFA swaps to fill out their team a little bit more, because it's a light lineup. I can admittedly say they lack depth on both position groups. Their goaltending situation, although a little more proven than Calgary's, just because Mackenzie Blackwood has been in the NHL for a few years and Askarov has done all there is to prove at the AHL level, very similarly to Dustin Wolf. I think I just like Blackwood a little bit more than I like Vladar, which isn't saying much because neither guy has shown a lot at the NHL level in a while. The last time both Blackwood and Vladar were good was 3-4 years ago when Blackwood was on the Devils and Vladar was the backup to Tuukka Rask in Boston. It's been a while for both of those goalies, so very similar goaltending situations. And I just think the Flames are going to sell guys. I think that's the deciding point for me, is that by the end of the season, I think that Calgary roster is going to be even more barren than it is right now.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that. I feel like Conroy is going to get what he can, especially for his pending UFAs this year, and then maybe still see if he can trade a guy with a little bit of term on his contract. But I feel like that could also wait until the summer as well. Number 6 for me, Nick, I have the Anaheim Ducks. I think the Ducks, they're starting to get closer, but I don't think they're there just yet. I love Leo Carlson. I think he's going to have a good year. Troy Terry, another very good player. Trevor Zegras, I'm curious to see what his full long-term future is with the Ducks. There's been, plenty of trade rumors these last couple of years surrounding him. I'm just intrigued to see what their plan overall for Zegras is there. Frank Petrano, especially against the Penguins, great goal scorer, but he's also one of the more underrated goal scorers in the league. And I'm also excited, Nick, about Cutter Gauthier. How is he going to play for the Ducks this year? I think he has the ability to be, especially in that Calder conversation for the Ducks this year. And, you look at up and down this forward group, it's honestly not bad at all. Mason McTavish as your third line center. Ryan Strome is also on the third line. You have Robbie Fabry there. Brock McGinn, I feel like at this point is at least a decent fourth liner. There's definitely quite a bit of talent in this forward. On defense, they got to figure out the Cam Fowler situation. Elliot Friedman on 32 Thoughts was kind of discussing that it sounds like a trade could be coming at some point. So if he goes, someone's obviously gonna have to replace him, but the rest of that defense, I mean, it's okay. You have Brian Dumoulin on a third pairing role. You have Radko Gudas there, who I think is at least a fine, number 4, number 5. Mintakov is pretty underrated at this point. Then goalie-wise, Dostal and John Gibson, I think Dostal is better than Gibson at this point. They still got to figure out that Gibson situation as well. But you look up and down this team, Nick, they're not a playoff team, but I don't think they're going to be in the basement this year. I think they're going to be a bit more improved. Again, not in the playoff race, but I do think that's hopefully coming in these next few years.
I like the team Anaheim has put together. I have Anaheim in this spot as well. I mean, you listed it. I mean, you got Carlson, Zegras, McTavish down the middle. Zegras stays healthy. He can flirt. He can be somewhere in the range of 60 to 75 points. You got Vetrano, who was a 35-goal guy last year. You got Gauthier, who we mentioned. Troy Terry has been a decent NHLer so far. The forward group has potential and has the opportunity to really I don't want to say punch above its weight, but kind of capitalize on the potential, because that's been the thing for the Ducks for a few years now. We all look at these lineups and these young guys and these prospects and say, well, if they put it all together, they could be pretty good. And we've been doing that for 3 years now, where they have a lot of young talent. They've picked at the top of the draft for a few years now. They got to figure out the back end. Other than Zellweger, they don't really have anyone young who has who does a lot to excite me. Other than him, on the back end, like Gudas is still solid, but other than him, I mean, Dumoulin was okay for Seattle last year. And then, as you said, Dostal should be the starter this year, but we got to take a quick break.
Should be fine for the Ducks. And I know they have more kids coming as well. That's the big thing. They have more guys that are coming in these next couple of years that should hopefully push them, back into at least competing for a playoff spot.
You're right. We're going to finish that thought, come back, keep making our way through the Pacific Division after this quick break. We are all driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way isn't to search at all. Don't search for a candidate, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. And Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster. 93% of employers agree. Indeed delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites, according to a recent Indeed survey. The thing I love about Indeed the most is that it leverages over 140 million qualifications and preferences every day, which means Indeed's matching engine is constantly learning from your preferences. So the more you use Indeed, the better it gets. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Thank you for making Locked On NHL your first listen of the day. For your second listen, enjoy the Locked On NFL Fantasy Podcast. Locked On Fantasy NFL provides you with a national perspective on all things NFL to set your lineups and own the waiver wire all across the National Football League. Available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So moving along in our list, we can take a quick look at the Seattle Kraken, who I have next. And you, on the other hand, have someone else. And I'm very curious to make your case. You tell me why you have the Kings below the Kraken, unlike me.
Yes, so I have the Kings at number 5 on my list. I know that's probably going to be a hot take to some people in the YouTube comments and people listening to this via Apple, Spotify, Sirius XM, or whatever, but I'm just not sure what the Kings' plan is right now. I feel like Rob Blake is trying to go in, a couple different directions. Like, obviously, this is the end of the line, at least a little bit in terms of, Drew Doughty and Kopitar for their careers. I mean, they're still very good players, but they're in the back 9 of their careers. You're not expecting Kopitar and Doughty to, fully carry the load like they used to back when they were younger. I really like Quentin Byfield overall. I think he's going to break out even more this year. Kevin Fiala, really good goal scorer. Philip Deneau, really good two-way center. They added Warren Fogle over the offseason. Adrian Kempe on the top line, very solid. I like Mikey Anderson as a defenseman. But, goaltending-wise, David Riddick and Darcy Kemper, not really feeling too confident with those two guys. I mean, Kemper was, I think, okay at best in Washington. Riddick is also kind of just fine overall. But I just think, when I've watched the Kings these last couple of years, they're fine in the regular season, but they really just haven't done the damage in the playoffs. And, part of that is playing Edmonton in the first round. You're going up against Connor McDavid, Leon Draisaitl, Evan Bouchard, etc. So they're kind of getting the wrong matchup. But I feel like even if they played one of the other Pacific teams, I feel like it would just not go well for them. I think if they do make the playoffs this year and maybe 5 teams from the Pacific get in, I still feel like they're just going to lose in the first round because I think they would play one of the top 2 seeds. But, when I look at their offseason overall, I feel like they, at least to me, they didn't really make, a big impact signing, at least for me. Yeah, they did get out of the Pierre-Luc Dubois deal, which was, I think, a really good job by the Kings front office to get out of that, considering how poorly it was aging so far. But I look at what Seattle did this offseason with some of the moves they made and the players they have returning, and I look at what the Kings did, and I'm like, I feel like I like Seattle at least a little bit more this year. Even though I do have questions about them, I'm just not really sure what direction the Kings are going in right now.
The thing is, I don't necessarily disagree. I understand your argument. I get what you're saying. The thing is, and I'll talk about both teams at once to kind of streamline this because the points are interconnected. So with LA, I know what they are. I've seen them do this a few years in a row now where if we let them, they will keep being one of the two wild cards and losing to the Oilers or whoever wins the Central in the first round every year in perpetuity until the core disbands, because they have a very high regular season floor. The main reason I have LA ahead of Seattle is LA's best players are better than Seattle's best players. Kopitar is better than any forward on Seattle. I would say Kevin Fiala is better than any forward on Seattle. I would say Adrian Kempe is close to being better than any forward on Seattle. I think Quentin Byfield has a higher ceiling than Shane Wright or Matty Beniers. I think Drew Doughty is better than any defenseman on Seattle. And the goaltending for both teams is a question mark. Rolling the dice on Darcy Kemper at this stage is just outright risky, but they went through last year with a combination of Cam Talbot and Phoenix Copley and a variety of guys. So I think the reason I have Seattle lower is very simple. I know what I'm getting from LA. Seattle, I don't necessarily know what I'm getting. They have a new coach in there, somebody who hasn't coached at the NHL level in quite a while. If I remember correctly, it's been 6 or 7 years since Dan Bylsma has been an NHL head coach. So I think I have a lot more knowns with LA, which is what I prioritize when I'm putting together these types of rankings. I want an understanding of what I can get. And I think LA has a higher floor. Seattle might have a higher ceiling, but Seattle's floor, I feel like, is a lot lower than LA's just because they don't have the high-end talent to carry the load the way LA does.
See, I do think those are very fair points. I think I just have Seattle, at least for me, at number 4. I really like their overall forward depth. I think when you look at these 4 lines in general, I think this is one of the more underrated forward groups in the league in terms of depth. Jared McCann on your top line, he's good for 30 to 35 goals. Matty Beniers, I think he's still scratching the surface. Jordan Eberle, he's usually good for, I would say, 20, 25 goals a season. Burakovsky, I think, could potentially have a big year. They just signed Chandler Stevenson, of course, which, was a big contract. I'm not sure he's going to live up to it, but I understood why Seattle did it because they want to get back to the playoffs. But, Yanni Gourde, very strong two-way third-line center. Bjorkstrand is usually good for 20 to 25 goals a season. I like Brandon Tanev on the fourth line. And then defensively, I understand your point about Drew Doughty, but Vince Dunn is also very good. I think
he is. Doughty's good. That's fair.
Yeah. Vince Dunn, people got to put some respect on his name a bit more.
I think it's hard I think Dunn is one of those guys where because he's an analytics darling, there are a lot of people who are just at the outset going to disqualify him from these types of conversations because they don't care or they don't know to care or want to care about it. But I do agree with you. Vince Dunn is a very good defenseman. Yeah, I think he's a very good number 1 on this team. Alexiak is a good 4. Montour's a good 3. He's playing on the second pairing. That was a big contract they signed. Goalie-wise, you're 100% right. Grubauer and Joey Decord, 2 big question marks in that. Both of these teams have big question marks. But I think what it came down to for me is with the moves Seattle made over the offseason, their forward group in general with their depth, and with Dan Bylsma, I think being in a more comfortable situation, I think that's going to put Seattle a little over the top for me heading into the season, 1 spot ahead of the Kings. I think with Bylsma, I do think there is a decent head coach in there. He was, good for a while with the Penguins before things went south. He then goes up to Buffalo where, that's just been what's the word I'm looking for here? Kind of a tire fire at times over the last several years. And he just really did not work out there. Now he's getting another chance in the NHL with, I think, a more stable organization in the Seattle Kraken. I do think he can make an impact behind the bench. And that's another one of the reasons why I do have Seattle at number 4. I do think that new coach bump could project them, could put them back into a playoff spot. Words are hard, as you can tell. Hunter and I keep tripping over our words this morning. We're both very tired, but we are going to power through in our final segment. We'll wrap up with the presumptive top three in the Pacific Division after this break. If you're like me and you're trying to cling on to the last bits of summer, get to one last concert, get to one last baseball game, I will be at a Met game this weekend, which I'm very happy about. The only place I am buying tickets for any event is through our friends over at Gametime, with some of the best features in the ticket buying experience, where you toggle on the all-in pricing feature at the front, and by the time you get to checkout, no surprise fees. My personal favorite, the most important thing, especially when it comes to going to baseball games, the seat view, where you can get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. If you're going to a baseball game, you want to be able to see balls and strikes. You want to be able to see if the ball's in play. Get an idea of what you're buying before you do. The lowest price guarantee, or Gametime, will credit you 110% of the difference. And Gametime ticket coverage, where your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Thursday edition of Locked On NHL, where Hunter and I are tackling the Pacific Division power rankings. So we both have the same team third. I think we both agree that Vegas is very top heavy. This is also the lightest a Vegas lineup has looked in quite a few years. You lose Jonathan Marchessault, you lose a Chandler Stevenson. You've had to really kind of call back the roster from the team that won the Cup 2 years ago. Mark Stone and Jack Eichel, great players, but how available are they? Another year older for Pietrangelo, another year older for William Karlsson, another year older for Ivan Barbashev. And I don't want to say they're staking a lot on unproven guys, but when you're talking about a top six that has guys like Victor Olofsson and Pavel Dorofeev, and you have Brendan Brisson and Alex Holtz in your bottom six, and you are leaving a lot to the idea that your good players can carry guys. The one thing I do want to say, I do think people are forgetting how good Noah Hanifin is because he was saddled on a really bad Flames team for a while. I think people are going to be very impressed when they see what Hanifin does in a full season in Vegas.
I think also people are just forgetting how good Vegas is in general. I've been seeing some predictions already for this season about how Vegas is going to finish fourth or fifth and potentially miss the playoffs. I'm like, you guys do realize this team still has quite a bit of high-end talent, and they have a very good coach in Bruce Cassidy. I don't know why so many people are picking them to miss. I mean, yeah, sure, they're a little bit top heavy, but we all know a move is probably coming in Vegas at some point during the season. They love going all in every single year. Their ownership dictates it. They have a very good front office. They are going to make a move or two during the season before the trade deadline overall this year. Jack Eichel, when healthy, very good top line center. Barbashev, you're right, another year older, but I do want to see a full year out of Tomas Hertl. I think he could be a really strong player for Vegas this year. Mark Stone, he just got to stay healthy. Olofsson, I think obviously very good on the power play. I do want to see again a little bit more 5-on-5. William Karlsson, again, he's usually, good for 20 to 30 goals a season. Defensively, I agree with you on Hanifin, Nick. I think people are going to realize just how good he is. And also, people are forgetting about Pietrangelo, Shea Theodore, two very good defensemen as well. They have three great defensemen on this team. Aiden Hill, I think he's a fine enough starter. He will give you at least average to above average goaltending overall. This team should be a playoff team this year. I have them third. Don't think they're going to win the Pacific. They may not even go on a deep playoff run, but this is still a team that should make the playoffs.
Agreed with you for sure. I think Vegas is high-end talent. I mean, they were injured beyond belief last year, and that's why they limped into a playoff spot the way they did. We have different for second and first. So I will let you go first. You tell me why Vancouver is going to finish ahead of Edmonton.
So yeah, I have Edmonton number 2, Vancouver number 1. I am all in on the Canucks for this season. JT Miller coming off another great year. Last year, I had him as one of my top 10 centers for last week's episode. I think he's going to be just as good this year. Brock Besser, I think he's also going to be, 25, 30 plus goal scorer this year. Pettersson had a great regular season last year. I expect that to continue this year, but I do want to see more out of him in the playoffs overall. Höglander, my son, I feel like he's going to be great in the top 6 for Vancouver. They just signed Jake DeBrusk to that long-term deal. I think long-term, it may not age that well, but right now is what counts. They're all in to win the Stanley Cup. I think it's really good right now. They brought back Dakota Joshua, who I think is one of the more underrated third liners in the NHL. Connor Garland, another very good third liner. You have Danton Heinen as well. Jim Rutherford knows him decently well. This forward group, I think right now, is deeper than it was last year. Sure, on defense, you lose Zadorov. He goes to Boston. That's a physical presence on your back end. But, you still have Quinn Hughes, who was great in all three zones. They brought back Hronek, who's a really good partner for him. Carson Soucy, when healthy, I think is a good number 4. Tyler Myers, I still don't understand the fascination with him overall. I mean, yeah, he's a big body. He'll lay the boom. He's still, I think, maybe okay at moving the puck, but he's still not nearly as good as he used to be. I still don't fully understand the thought process there. And then in goal, I am banking on at least the goaltending being great this year. I understand the situation with Demko. I understand the situation with Shilovs. If both are healthy, and I understand that is a big if, Nick, but if both are healthy heading into this season, that is arguably the best tandem in the Pacific. Demko, one of the top goaltenders on the planet. Elliot Friedman was talking about how he might just have to learn to play through this injury. And if he does and he's able to play well, I think the sky's the limit for this Vancouver team, man. I'm really high on them this year. And Rick Tocchet, great head coach. I have Vancouver number 1, and then I have Edmonton number 2 for me.
So the reason I have Edmonton ahead of Vancouver, and I am going to make fun of Edmonton for a minute here first, but I think the argument for Edmonton is what you just saw. You saw the way they were able to put it together. You saw the way that Chris Knobloch was able to push all of the right buttons basically for 4 straight months, where they rattled off like a 700 points percentage after he got the job. I think you saw how good Stuart Skinner can be in the long run this past season. And I think that's the real volatility on that Edmonton team. Each of the last 2 years, they have started with Jack Campbell, and he has entirely capitulated in the first 10 to 15 games, and Skinner has saved their butts 2 separate times. Now, coming into the season, Skinner and Calvin Pickard is a little daunting when you think about it in comparison to some of the other tandems around the league, but it was good enough in the playoffs. The forward group is maybe the best first 9 forwards in the entire NHL. The only real issue I have with Edmonton is the defense, but when you look at it in comparison to Vancouver's got just as many question marks as Edmonton does.
Fair.
When you go and look at it, the argument for Vancouver over Edmonton is the goaltending, in my opinion. But you look at that Vancouver back end, I think Hughes and Hronek is just a smidge worse than Bouchard Ekholm, and that's because Ekholm is better than Hronek, not because Bouchard is better than Hughes. Soucy, Tyler Myers is a massive, I don't want to say a question mark, but Tyler Myers just doesn't inspire confidence for me. And then Forbort and Desharnais, they're both good penalty killers, but that's not exactly a confidence-inspiring pair. So I think being that Edmonton has shown how high of a ceiling they have, and the other part of this, and I've said this a few times on this episode, I want to see Vancouver do it again. Last year, they had everything possible go right for them. And you can make an argument they probably should have beaten Edmonton based on the way that series was developing. And they really should have, in all honesty. They lost the game to Calvin Pickard.
That was a very 50-50 series.
It was. You think about how that series was going, where it was 3-2. They went to Pickard, and they pulled one out. And they probably shouldn't have, in all honesty, because Vancouver was doing a great job. You mentioned Dakota Joshua and Connor Garland. They were 2 of the most impactful players in that entire series. Because the top 6s were kind of playing to a push, it was the depth guys that were proving to be a difference. But that will just about do it for today's edition of Locked On NHL. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts, or over on YouTube as well. If you're watching over on YouTube, leave us a comment. Let us know the order you think the teams in the Pacific Division are going to finish in this year. Hunter and I will talk to you guys next week, where we will tackle the Central Division. Until then.